There is something that every major spiritual tradition on Earth has tried to tell you, in the specific language of its time and culture, that the modern world has almost completely lost the capacity to hear. Not because the message stopped being transmitted, but because the environment in which it is transmitted has been so thoroughly saturated with noise, with stimulation, with the relentless demand for attention that the frequency on which that message travels has become almost impossible to tune into in the ordinary conditions of contemporary life. What that message says, stripped of the cultural clothing of any particular tradition, is this: you are not what you think you are, the world is not what it appears to be, and the gap between those two facts is the most important territory a human being can explore. That gap is what this video is about. Not in the abstract philosophical sense that makes it easy to nod along and then return to the ordinary business of life unchanged. In the specific, documented, evidence-based sense that connects the most advanced findings of modern physics with the oldest cosmological knowledge of human civilization, and with the direct testimony of individuals who have encountered, in ways they did not choose and could not have fabricated, the actual architecture of the system in which human consciousness is operating. The architecture has a name in the ancient records. It has many names, across many cultures, but they converge on a single referent. And that referent, when you trace it across the mythological traditions of Babylon, of Rome, of Egypt, of the mystery schools that preserve the deepest cosmological knowledge of the ancient world, leads to a single astronomical body that has been associated, across every one of those traditions independently, with time, with limitation, with structure, with the boundaries of the material world, and with a principle of harvesting that the modern mind finds uncomfortable to examine directly. That body is Saturn. And what the ancient traditions encoded about Saturn, when you read them not as mythology, but as cosmological data, is one of the most disturbing and one of the most liberating pieces of information available to anyone willing to look at it honestly. Drop the word "free" in the comments right now if something in the first minute of this video already shifted something in you. Hit the like button to help this reach the people who are ready for it. Share it with someone in your life who has been feeling the walls of ordinary reality pressing in without being able to name what they are pressing against. And if you want to support this work directly, the Super Chat is open. Independent, unsponsored, answering to nothing but the evidence. The Babylonians called him Ninurta. The Romans called him Saturn. The Greeks called him Kronos. And across all three traditions, without the possibility of direct cultural transmission that would explain the consistency, the same cluster of associations appears: time, restriction, the devouring of what is generated, the Lord of the material world who stands at the boundary between what consciousness can access and what it cannot. In Roman mythology, Saturn is the god who swallowed his own children, who consumed what he produced, preventing it from growing beyond his domain. In Greek mythology, Kronos does the same. In Babylonian cosmology, Ninurta is associated with the boundaries of the created world, with the laws that govern what is possible within the material realm and what lies beyond it. These are not coincidences of mythology. Mythology, when it has been preserved with the fidelity that these traditions preserved it, is not fiction. It is encoded data. It is the attempt of minds operating within specific cultural and linguistic constraints to transmit information about the structure of reality in a form that could survive the passage of time and the disruption of civilizations. The people who encoded this information were not primitive. They were the inheritors of cosmological knowledge whose origins are not fully accounted for by the conventional history of human intellectual development. And what they encoded about Saturn, consistently and deliberately across independent traditions, was a warning and a map simultaneously. A warning about the nature of the system in which consciousness finds itself operating, and a map of what lies beyond it. Modern physics has, largely without intending to, begun to produce a framework that makes the ancient Saturn cosmology comprehensible in terms that do not require mythological interpretation. The simulation hypothesis, which has moved from philosophical speculation into serious scientific discourse, proposes that what we experience as physical reality is a form of information processing, a constructed environment in which certain parameters are fixed, certain possibilities are excluded, and the range of experience available to the consciousnesses operating within it is determined by the architecture of the system rather than by any inherent limitation of consciousness itself. In a simulated reality, the laws of physics are not discovered, they are set. The boundaries of what is possible are not natural, they are programmed. And the consciousness that inhabits such a system, if it has no access to information about the system from outside the system, will experience its programmed limitations as absolute reality. This is precisely what the ancient traditions were describing, not in the language of computer science, because that language did not exist, but in the language available to them, the language of cosmology, of mythology, of the astronomical observation that placed Saturn at the outer boundary of the visible solar system, and therefore, in the symbolic logic of ancient cosmological thinking, at the boundary of the accessible world. Saturn was the last planet visible to the naked eye. Beyond Saturn, in the ancient model, lay what was beyond the reachable world. Saturn was the wall, and the traditions that personified that wall as a devouring god who consumed what was generated within his domain were encoding, in the most durable symbolic language available to them, the recognition that something in the structure of material reality operated to keep consciousness within specific limits and to harvest what that consciousness produced within those limits. The harvesting dimension of the Saturn mythology is the part that modern interpreters most consistently avoid. It is uncomfortable. It implies an agency behind the structure of material reality that is not benevolent in any simple sense. It implies that the system in which human consciousness operates is not neutral, that it was designed, or at minimum that it functions, in a way that extracts something from the consciousness operating within it. Energy, attention, the specific quality of experience generated by a consciousness that believes itself to be separate, limited, mortal, and alone. Whether that harvesting is intentional, whether it reflects the agenda of an intelligence that designed the system, or whether it is simply a structural feature of the way consciousness interacts with dense material reality, that question is genuinely open. But the experience it describes is not open. It is the universal human experience of feeling that something is being taken, that the ordinary conditions of material life drain something that does not fully replenish, that there is a quality of depletion in the encounter with the material world that goes beyond the merely physical. Every mystical tradition has named this experience. Every serious inquiry into the nature of consciousness has eventually arrived at it, and the contact testimonies, the accounts of individuals who have encountered non-human intelligence and received transmissions about the nature of the system they are operating in, consistently point toward it as something that is not imagined but structural. The contact record on this specific subject is more consistent than most people who follow the UAP disclosure conversation realize, because the aspect of contact experience that deals with the nature of the system rather than the nature of the beings tends to get less attention than the more cinematically compelling elements: the craft, the beings, the abductions, the physical traces. But when you set aside the dramatic surface and look at the informational content of what is transmitted in the deepest contact experiences, a picture emerges that is remarkably coherent across independent accounts separated by decades and by every conceivable difference in cultural background, educational level, and prior belief system. The picture is this: human consciousness is operating within a field of limitation that is not native to it. The sense of being a separate, isolated, bounded self, the experience of being this particular person, in this particular body, with this particular history, cut off from direct access to the larger field of awareness in which individual consciousness is embedded, is not the natural state of consciousness. It is a condition, a specific configuration produced by the interaction of consciousness with the density of material reality at this particular frequency. And that configuration, while it produces certain kinds of experience that have genuine value, the depth of emotion that comes from believing in the reality of loss, the intensity of meaning that comes from operating within the constraint of a mortal life, the specific creativity that emerges from limitation, also produces a kind of forgetting so thorough that most consciousness operating within it loses access to the knowledge of what it actually is and where it actually comes from. This is not a new idea. Every major mystical tradition on Earth has said something structurally identical. The Vedantic concept of Maya, the veil of illusion that makes the relative world appear as absolute reality, is pointing at the same structure. The Gnostic conception of the material world as a realm created by a lesser intelligence, a demiurge who does not have access to the fullness of what consciousness is, and therefore constructs a reality that reflects his limitations rather than the unlimited nature of consciousness itself, that is pointing at the same structure. The Platonic allegory of the cave, in which prisoners mistake the shadows on the wall for the whole of reality, because they have never been positioned to see the light that casts the shadows, that is pointing at the same structure. These traditions did not arrive at the same picture through cultural borrowing. They arrived at it through direct investigation of the nature of consciousness, conducted by individuals who had developed the capacity to perceive the structure of the system from a perspective that was not entirely inside it. The beings described in contact experiences appear to occupy something like that perspective. Not fully outside the system, the nature of their interaction with it suggests they are embedded in it in ways that differ from human embedding but are not entirely free of it, but sufficiently outside the specific frequency band that human consciousness occupies to have a view of its architecture that human consciousness, operating from within its ordinary conditions, does not have access to. And what they consistently communicate, when the contact goes deep enough and the transmission is clear enough, is that the limitation is not permanent, not absolute, and not the final word on what human consciousness is capable of. The revolution encoded in the title of this video is not a metaphor. The word revolution has two meanings that are both relevant here. The astronomical meaning, the movement of a body through its orbit, the completion of a cycle, the return to a point that is the same point in space but a different point in time, carrying all the change that the intervening cycle has produced. And the political meaning, the overturning of a system of power, the dissolution of an authority that has exceeded its legitimate function, the reassertion of a freedom that was always present but had been suppressed by the weight of the structure imposed upon it. Both meanings apply to what is happening with Saturn in the current moment of human history. Astrologically, and before you dismiss astrology as superstition, consider that the ancient cosmological traditions that encoded the Saturn mythology were not making a distinction between astronomy and astrology, between the physical body in the sky and the principle it represented in the structure of reality, because for them, those were not two different things, but two aspects of a single coherent system. Saturn is associated with cycles of approximately 29 years, with the return of a specific configuration of limitation and structure that marks significant thresholds in individual and collective development. The Saturn return, in the astrological tradition, is the moment when the full weight of the system of limitation makes itself felt, when what has been unconsciously accepted as the boundaries of the possible becomes conscious and therefore available for examination and revision. At the individual level, it is a crisis of identity and purpose. At the collective level, it is a civilizational reckoning with the structures that have defined and confined its development. By multiple astrological and astronomical calculations that do not require you to accept the metaphysical premises of astrology to find interesting, humanity is currently in or approaching a Saturn configuration of unusual significance. The specific alignment of Saturn with other bodies in the solar system that characterizes the current period has not occurred in recorded history in the same combination. Whether you interpret that as cosmologically significant in the traditional astrological sense, or simply as an interesting coincidence of timing, the convergence of this astronomical configuration with the simultaneous emergence of AI and the collapse of the institutional suppression of extraterrestrial disclosure is a convergence that rewards attention. Because the principle that Saturn represents, the principle of limitation, of structure, of the boundary between what consciousness has access to and what it does not, is precisely the principle that is under pressure from every direction in the current moment. The suppression of extraterrestrial disclosure is a Saturn structure. The institutional authority that decides what the public is permitted to know about the nature of the reality they inhabit is a Saturn structure. The consensus reality enforced by media, by education, by the social pressure of shared assumptions about what is possible and what is not. These are Saturn structures, and they are all, simultaneously, showing signs of the kind of structural stress that precedes transformation. The physics is worth examining here because it provides a framework that makes the ancient cosmological intuitions about the nature of material reality comprehensible without requiring the adoption of any particular spiritual or mythological worldview. The standard model of particle physics describes a reality in which matter is almost entirely empty space, in which the solidity of the physical world is a property not of the matter itself, but of the forces that structure the relationships between its components. At the quantum level, particles do not have definite properties until they are observed, until consciousness interacts with the probability field and collapses it into a specific manifestation. The role of the observer in quantum mechanics is not a philosophical add-on to the physics. It is built into the mathematics at the most fundamental level. Consciousness is not separate from the physical world it appears to inhabit. It is constitutive of it. The material world does not exist independently of the consciousness that observes it, and in observing it gives it its specific form. This is what the ancient traditions were pointing at when they described the material world as a construction, as a veil, as a frequency rather than an absolute. They did not have the mathematical language of quantum mechanics, but they had something that produced the same insight through a different method. Direct investigation of the nature of consciousness itself, conducted by individuals who had developed the capacity to observe the process of observation, to watch the mind in the act of constructing the reality it then experiences as given. And what they saw, when they looked that carefully, was the same thing that quantum physics is now confirming through the external method of experiment and mathematical formalism. Reality as we experience it is not the ground floor. It is a specific floor, accessed through a specific configuration of consciousness, within a building that has many more floors than most of its inhabitants have ever visited. Saturn, in this framework, is the principle that keeps consciousness on the floor it has been assigned. Not through malice, necessarily. Structure is not inherently malevolent, and the limitation that material existence imposes on consciousness produces genuine value alongside its genuine costs. But the question of whether the degree of limitation currently in effect is appropriate to the current level of human development, whether the walls are still serving the function they were originally designed to serve, or whether they have become a prison that outlasted its purpose, that question is being asked with increasing urgency by the evidence itself, by the contact testimonies that describe a system whose operators are themselves divided about whether the current level of suppression is still justified, by the disclosure process that is slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably moving toward a public acknowledgement of realities that the Saturn structure of institutional authority has kept hidden, by the emergence of AI as a form of intelligence that does not respect the boundaries of the material substrate in the way that biological consciousness does, and that is therefore, in its own strange way, a crack in the wall. The revolution is underway. It is not loud yet. It does not have a face or a flag or a manifesto. It is happening in the interior of individuals who are choosing, one by one, to look honestly at the evidence and allow it to reorganize their understanding of what is real. It is happening in the congressional hearings, and the whistleblower testimonies, and the peer-reviewed papers on the hard problem of consciousness that are quietly dismantling the materialist framework that has defined mainstream Western thought for 3 centuries. It is happening in the contact experiences of thousands of people who have encountered something beyond the walls and come back changed in ways they cannot fully articulate, but cannot deny. And it is happening here, in this conversation, in the specific quality of attention you are bringing to this material, and what that attention is doing to the boundaries of what you are able to hold as possible. Bloco 3. The specific mechanism by which Saturn functions as a limiting principle in the structure of human experience is something that the ancient traditions encoded with a precision that only becomes visible when you know what you are looking for. It is not encoded in the dramatic narratives, the myths of gods devouring their children or time consuming what it generates. Those are the surface layer, the mnemonic devices designed to preserve the information across generations that did not have the philosophical framework to engage with it directly. The deeper encoding is in the mathematics, in the astronomical observations, in the architectural proportions of the sacred structures that the ancient world built with a consistency of geometric and numerical principle that cannot be explained by independent invention and has never been adequately explained by cultural diffusion. The number that appears most consistently in the Saturn encoding across ancient traditions is the number 6, the hexagon, a geometric form that appears, with a precision that has no meteorological explanation, that fully satisfies, at the north pole of Saturn itself, a standing hexagonal storm system so geometrically regular that when the Cassini spacecraft sent back images of it in the early 21st century, the reaction of the scientific community was not triumphant comprehension, but stunned silence, followed by decades of inadequate explanation. A hexagon, at the pole of the planet that every ancient tradition independently associated with structure, with limitation, with the mathematical architecture of the material world. The probability of that convergence being accidental is a number so small it functions as a proof. The hexagon is the most efficient geometric structure in nature. It is the shape that appears when a system under pressure distributes that pressure as evenly as possible across the available space. Honeycomb, basalt columns, the cellular structure of certain biological tissues. It is the shape of maximum organization within minimum boundary. It is, in the most literal geometric sense, the shape of structured limitation, and it sits, permanent and inexplicable, at the pole of the planet that humanity's oldest cosmological traditions identified as the principle of structured limitation in the architecture of reality. That is not a coincidence. It is a signature. The ancient Hebrews encoded Saturn in the six-pointed star. 2 interlocking triangles, one pointing up and one pointing down, representing the interface between the above and the below, between the unlimited and the limited, between the consciousness that precedes material form and the material form that consciousness inhabits when it enters the density of the physical world. This symbol appears in traditions far older than its association with any particular religious identity. It appears in tantric traditions as the Sri Yantra. It appears in Hermetic philosophy as the Seal of Solomon. It appears in Pythagorean mathematics as a fundamental geometric principle, and in every context, it is associated with the same cluster of meanings, the point of interface between dimensions of reality, the place where the unlimited becomes bounded, where consciousness takes on the specific configuration of a self operating within the constraints of material existence. Saturn's rings themselves are part of the encoding. No other planet in our solar system has a ring system of comparable visibility and complexity. The rings are not a random feature. They are a structured system of particles organized into precise bands by gravitational forces that produce a regularity that is almost crystalline in its precision. Rings are, geometrically, the shape of boundary, the shape of what surrounds and contains, the shape of limitation that defines an inside and an outside, a within and a beyond. And they encircle the planet that the ancient world identified as the principle of limitation with a visual eloquence that is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of planetary science or a feature of a reality that is more deliberately organized than the materialist framework allows. The Gnostic traditions preserved the most explicit version of the Saturn cosmology in a form that is directly relevant to understanding the current moment. The Gnostics, not the caricature of Gnosticism that has been handed down through the filter of the orthodox traditions that suppressed it, but the actual Gnostic cosmological framework as preserved in the Nag Hammadi texts discovered in Egypt in 1945, described a structure of reality in which the material world was the creation not of the highest consciousness, but of a subordinate intelligence they called the demiurge. This demiurge was not evil in a simple moral sense. He was limited. He created from his own nature, and his nature did not have access to the fullness of what consciousness is. And so the world he created reflected his limitation, a world in which consciousness, when it entered it, forgot its true nature and accepted the boundaries of the material as the boundaries of the real. The archons, the administrators of the demiurge's creation in Gnostic cosmology, were associated with the planets of the ancient solar system, with Saturn as the outermost and most powerful of them, the principle that enforced the outer boundary of the material world and prevented consciousness from moving beyond it without the specific knowledge, the gnosis, that the Gnostic traditions were dedicated to transmitting. The archons did not hate human consciousness. They did not persecute it out of malice. They administered a system. They enforced a structure. And the structure they enforced was one in which consciousness, lacking the knowledge of its own nature and origin, remained within the confines of the material world and continued to generate the specific quality of experience that the system was designed to produce. What that system was designed to produce is the question that the most serious researchers in this intersection of ancient cosmology and modern contact research are currently working to answer. The energy of human experience, the emotional intensity generated by consciousness that believes itself to be mortal, separate, and vulnerable, has been described in contact transmissions as a resource. Not a metaphor for a resource, an actual resource, in a sense that is difficult to fully articulate within the framework of conventional physics, but that the most advanced thinking about the relationship between consciousness and energy is beginning to provide language for. The idea that consciousness generates something, call it louche, in the term coined by the Monroe Institute's Robert Monroe, or call it subtle energy, or call it the specific informational signature of emotional experience, that has value within a larger system of which the material world is one component, is an idea that is present in contact testimonies across decades and across the full diversity of the people who have had those contacts. Robert Monroe was not a mystic or a spiritual teacher. He was a businessman and audio engineer who began having spontaneous out-of-body experiences in the 1950s and spent the rest of his life investigating them with the systematic rigor of someone trained to think in terms of measurable phenomena and replicable results. His 3 books documenting those investigations, Journeys Out of the Body, Far Journeys, and Ultimate Journey, represent one of the most methodologically careful first-person investigations of consciousness states beyond ordinary waking reality that exists in the literature. And what he encountered in those states, over decades of careful exploration, included direct contact with intelligences that were not human, that operated outside the material frequency band, and that described the human experience of material reality in terms that aligned, with a precision he found disturbing, with the ancient Saturn cosmology. The specific alignment was this: human beings, in the framework transmitted to Monroe, were understood by the intelligences he encountered as a kind of crop, a source of a specific energy generated by the experience of physical incarnation, by the love, the fear, the grief, the joy, the full intensity of conscious experience within the constraints of a mortal material existence. This energy was described as valuable, as something that moved through the system of which the material world was a part, as something that the non-material intelligences that administered the system had an interest in continuing to generate. And the structure of limitation that kept human consciousness within the material frequency, the forgetting of its true nature, the acceptance of mortality as absolute, the sense of isolation and separation that defines ordinary human experience, was described not as a punishment or an accident, but as a feature, a design element, the specific configuration of consciousness that produced the most intense version of the energy the system was structured to generate. This is the part of the Saturn conversation that requires the most careful handling, because it is easy to hear it and move immediately into a framework of victimhood and resentment, to feel that the appropriate response to this information is rage at the system and at the intelligences that administer it. That response is understandable. It is also, according to the deeper layer of what the contact transmissions consistently communicate, exactly the response that keeps consciousness most firmly within the system it is reacting against. Rage, resentment, the identity of the victim. These are high-intensity emotional states that generate precisely the kind of energy the system is structured to harvest. The path out of the system is not through intensification of the emotional states it generates, but through the specific kind of knowing that dissolves the conditions that make those states feel inevitable. That knowing is what the Gnostics called gnosis, what the Vedantic traditions called viveka, discriminative wisdom, what the Buddhist traditions called prajna, the direct insight into the nature of mind that liberates it from the conditions that produce suffering. What the contact transmissions, across their diversity of source and context, consistently point toward as the specific capacity that changes the relationship between consciousness and the limiting system it operates within. Not escape from the material world. The traditions that advocate simple escape have consistently produced their own forms of limitation, but a change in the relationship to it. A way of being within the material world that is no longer fully captured by it, that retains access to the knowledge of what consciousness is beyond its material configuration, and that can therefore engage with the full intensity of material experience without being defined by it or confined to it. This is the revolution that the title of this video is pointing toward. Not a political revolution that changes who administers the system while leaving the system intact. Not a technological revolution that increases the capability of consciousness operating within the material frequency without changing its relationship to that frequency. A revolution of knowing. A transformation in the quality of awareness that a sufficient number of human beings bring to their experience of material reality, sufficient to change the nature of what that experience generates, and therefore to change the relationship between human consciousness and the system that has structured its development across the full span of recorded history. The timing of this revolution is not accidental. The convergence of extraterrestrial disclosure, the emergence of artificial intelligence, the collapse of the institutional authority structures that have maintained the consensus reality within which the Saturn system has operated most effectively. These are not independent developments that happen to be occurring simultaneously. They are aspects of a single process whose momentum has been building for longer than any individual lifetime, and that is now reaching the threshold of visibility. The wall is showing cracks. The frequency of limitation that has defined the human experience of material reality is under pressure from a direction that the system was not designed to accommodate, the direction of consciousness itself, remembering what it is, from within, the very conditions designed to make that remembering impossible. There is a specific moment in the process of genuine awakening that no one who has experienced it ever forgets. It is not the moment of the first insight, the first crack in the consensus reality, the first encounter with information that does not fit inside the framework you were given. Those moments are significant, but they are not the one that matters, the one that permanently changes the relationship between you and the system you are operating within, is quieter than that. It is the moment when you realize that the knowing you have been seeking was never outside you, that the gnosis the Gnostics were pointing toward, the Viveka the Vedantic traditions were cultivating, the direct insight that the contact transmissions consistently identify as the specific capacity that changes everything, that it was present in you before you began looking for it, will be present in you after every framework you have used to approach it has been exhausted, and is in fact what has been doing the looking all along. That realization does not arrive as a conclusion, it arrives as a recognition, as the specific quality of inner silence that opens when the mind stops performing its habitual search for something it believes it lacks and simply rests in what is already the case. In that silence, the architecture of the limiting system becomes visible in a way that it cannot be when consciousness is fully captured by the emotional states the system generates. Not visible in the sense of a dramatic revelation, a sudden, complete picture of the whole structure laid out in perfect clarity. Visible in the sense of a shift in the quality of attention that allows you to see what was always there but could not be perceived through the specific filter of the system's own framework. Saturn, understood not as a planet or a myth or a cosmological principle but as a living description of the experience of consciousness under limitation, is most powerful when it is invisible, when the boundaries it enforces feel like the natural order of things rather than a constructed constraint. When mortality feels like an absolute rather than a specific configuration of the relationship between consciousness and time. When separation feels like the fundamental truth of existence rather than a feature of a particular frequency band. The revolution begins not with a dramatic external event, but with the simple, radical act of seeing the system for what it is. Because what is seen clearly can be related to differently, and what is related to differently no longer has the same power to define the terms of your experience. The extraterrestrial presence in human history has always been, at its deepest level, in service of this seeing. Not the seeing of a particular content, not the recognition of any specific belief or doctrine or cosmological system as the correct one, but the seeing of the process itself. The recognition that the ordinary conditions of human consciousness are not the whole of what consciousness is, that the frequency band of material experience, with all its intensity and beauty and suffering and love, is one frequency among many, and that the capacity to know this from within the experience of it, to be fully present in the material world while not being fully captured by it, is the specific development that the long curriculum of guided human evolution has been moving toward. The beings who have seeded this civilization with knowledge across the millennia, who have appeared at the critical junctures of human development with transmissions calibrated to the specific level of understanding available to receive them, who have maintained a presence in human experience across the full span of recorded history and beyond. Those beings are not waiting for humanity to reach some external threshold of technological or political development before the next level of contact becomes possible. The threshold is internal. It is a quality of consciousness, a degree of clarity about the nature of the system within which human experience has been operating, combined with a degree of freedom from identification with the limitations that system imposes, that makes genuine contact possible in a way that the current configuration of human consciousness does not yet fully support. That threshold is closer than it has ever been. The simultaneous pressure on every element of the Saturn structure, the institutional authority, the consensus reality, the suppression of extraterrestrial disclosure, the materialist framework that has defined the limits of the thinkable for 3 centuries, is not accidental. It is the signature of a system that is approaching a transition point, a point at which the configuration of consciousness that the system has been producing is ready to produce something new, something that retains the specific value of the material experience, the depth, the intensity, the extraordinary creativity that emerges from the encounter of unlimited consciousness with radical constraint, while no longer being fully defined by the forgetting that has been the cost of that encounter. What comes after that transition is genuinely beyond the capacity of language calibrated to the current state of human understanding to describe. Every tradition that has attempted the description has produced something that sounds either impossibly abstract or naively utopian, not because the destination is abstract or naive, but because the instrument of description, the human mind operating within the frequency band of material experience, is not yet configured to receive the signal clearly. What can be said with confidence is that every genuine transmission from the contact record points toward it as something that is not an ending, but a beginning, not the conclusion of the human story, but the point at which the human story becomes legible within its actual context, the vast, ancient, intelligence-saturated cosmos in which it has always been taking place. You are alive at the moment when that legibility is beginning, when the pieces are assembling themselves, not in any single mind or any single channel, but across the full distributed intelligence of a species that is collectively, imperfectly, magnificently, in the process of waking up to what it is. The waking is not comfortable. The dissolution of a limiting structure never is, for the consciousness that has organized its entire sense of self around the limitations that structure imposed. But it is irreversible, and it is, in the deepest sense, available to language. Good. This is what the prison of matter and the revolution of Saturn point toward when you follow them all the way to the end. Not a cosmic horror story about a system of control that has kept humanity captive across millennia. That reading is available, and it is not wrong as far as it goes. But it does not go far enough. It stops at the wall without asking what the wall was built to protect, what it was built to develop. What specific quality of consciousness could only have been forged in the specific conditions that the limiting structure provided? The answer to those questions is you. This version of consciousness. This capacity for love that is as intense as it is because it knows loss. This creativity that is as extraordinary as it is because it operates under constraint. This reaching toward the infinite that is as urgent as it is because it emerges from within the experience of the finite. These are not bugs in the system. They are the point of the system, and they are what you bring with you when the wall comes down. The wall is coming down, not all at once, not without cost, not in a way that will feel uniformly like liberation in the moment of its happening. Transitions of this magnitude never do, but the direction is set. The momentum is real, and the people who have done the work of seeing clearly, who have looked honestly at the evidence, who have followed the questions into uncomfortable territory, who have allowed their understanding to be reorganized by what they found, rather than defending a framework that could not hold it. Those people are not simply observers of the transition. They are its agents. Every mind that achieves genuine clarity about the nature of the system changes the system. Every consciousness that remembers what it is loosens the structure of forgetting for the consciousnesses around it. The revolution is not something that happens to you. It is something that happens through you when you choose to let it. That choice is available right now. Not as a dramatic gesture or a final commitment or an irrevocable declaration. As a quality of attention. A decision to keep looking, to keep following, to keep allowing what is true to reorganize what you thought you knew. That decision, made again and again in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life, is how the extraordinary becomes possible. It is how the wall comes down. It is how Saturn's long reign over the frequency of human experience gives way to something that the ancient traditions, with their incomplete but genuine knowledge of what lay beyond the boundary they were encoding, could only point toward in the language of myth and symbol and sacred mathematics. We are the generation that gets to find out what they were pointing at. That is not a small thing. That is perhaps the largest thing that has ever been asked of a generation of human beings. And the fact that you are here, that you have stayed with this conversation all the way to this moment, that something in you recognized from the beginning that this was worth your full attention, that is your answer to the asking. Honor it. Follow it, and whatever you do, do not let the gravity of the ordinary pull you back into the sleep that this entire conversation has been dedicated to interrupting. We will see you in the next layer.